Welcome to the City Movement Podcast. Each episode, we'll dive deeply into the Christian mission of the YMCA, provide practical tips for planting churches in Ys, and discuss the benefits of planting churches in the YMCA. We're your hosts, Jeff Snyder and Mike Newman. Thanks for spending some time with us today. Let's jump into today's episode. Well, thanks for joining us in our first episode of the City Movement Podcast. This is Jeff Snyder, and I'm here with Mike Newman and Dave Newman, and we are thrilled to be recording this podcast and entering kind of a new phase of our ministry of the City Movement.
Good to be here with you guys.
Yep. How you doing, Mike?
I'm doing great. Glad to talk about some things that we love and what the Lord has called us to.
Yeah, Me too. This has been in our heart and a passion that the Lord's just been stirring up in us for a long time. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah. Well, today what we're doing is just kind of introing who we are. If we're going to talk about the City Movement, we kind of think the place to start is talking about the kind of the people of the City Movement. So we're going to talk about each of us and our story and how that ties into being here. And we're going to talk about at a high level, what is the City Movement? So I figured that would be the best place to start. So what is the City Movement? Dave, I'm going to let you kick us off.
Sure.
You're our subject matter expert today. Mike and I will be on all the podcasts, kind of wading through the waters, and we're going to have different people kind of come in and out to talk about their areas of expertise. So this is Dave Newman. He's the senior pastor at Antioch Church in the Countryside YMCA. Dave, why don't you kick us off? What is the City Movement?
Yeah, when we say City Movement, okay, it's an acronym for Church in the YMCA. And we really have a passion and a life calling for helping to plant churches within the YMCA. And that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. And this movement is just this network of churches that are like-minded and kind of tethered together, and certainly not, absolutely the same in every single belief or every ministry philosophy, but we have some great unifying factors that we actually love the YMCA, and we actually love, above all things, love Jesus, and want to be biblically based and missionally minded, and really see an amazing opportunity before us in planting churches in and through the YMCA.
Yeah, I think you said that well. I would even say one of the things you said was we're certainly not all the same.
Right.
And we're all very different, but we're all unified by two things: wanting to lift the gospel high and plant churches, and in agreement that we believe that the YMCA is the place to do that. Like when we think through our minds, we can't think of a better place to plant churches all across the country and all across the world.
Yeah. And something specific, it's right off the bat, we said church in the YMCA. And a huge distinction that we need to make right out of the gates is that when we talk about planting churches in the YMCA, we don't use the word at. We don't use a word that would seem to somehow indicate this is a place where it's good just to rent a room. This is a place just to be there for a stepping stone until you get to another place. But we're saying in the sense that this is a place to really become a partner with. And it's a movement and a mission that there's great synergy when you really partner with and be all in there. And so that's why we say in the YMCA. You guys have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, Jeff, if you would pick a crowd, like who would be interested in listening to this podcast or interested in listening to guys talk about life in the church, life in the YMCA, partnering with the Who would you say is the targeted audience?
Yeah, I think we could be targeting a large audience. Mm-hmm. The kind of the first pass of people I would say would be, if you're a church planter, mm-hmm. We want you to listen to this. If you're thinking about planting a church, mm-hmm. We want you to kind of hear what we're talking about and hear our vision as to why we think mm-hmm. the YMCA not just here in our local community in Cincinnati, Ohio, but across America and across the world, why the YMCA should be at the top of your consideration list for planning a church. I would also say churches that are already meeting in YMCAs. We're going to be talking about practical tips down the road for what it looks like to have church in the YMCA. Maybe even during certain seasons, we'll talk about, what does it look like to partner with your YMCA during Christmas time? Yeah. What does that look like? And then I would also say, if you are on staff at a YMCA or go to a YMCA or a member at a YMCA, we want you to listen to this podcast because we want to share our vision of why a church meeting in your YMCA has benefits, of why it's so natural for a church to partner with a YMCA in unison.
Yep. And many people don't know this because many people, when they hear the words YMCA, they think the family-friendly gym and swim. Or maybe they just think of a song by the Village People with hand motions. But many people don't realize something that has just stunned us. And that is that there are over 14,000 YMCAs all over the world, over 120 countries. And it is, and I'm going to put this next sentence in quotes, it is, outside of the local church, the largest Christian organization in the world. Obviously, that needs some unpacking. Obviously, we're going to say, what, a Christian organization? Has it drifted? And the answer is going to be yes in certain places. But 14,000 YMCAs and something that just keeps us up at night and gives us just this thriving passion that we can't get enough of is that if the YMCA were to truly live out its core purpose and its original mission, that the largest Christian organization in the world could be this mighty stream of renewal for fulfilling the Great Commission and spreading the good news of Jesus all over the world. So, and we think that there can be a church planted within every one of these 14,000 YMCAs.
Yeah, well said, David. Well said. So
for season 1, well said.
Yeah, yeah, we'll get better.
Yeah,
So the city movement, Church in the Y movement, we are recording this podcast in a YMCA. So even to further kind of show our belief that we want to do church in the YMCA, it's why we're here. And David has been pastoring our church. We represent a couple different churches, but one of them is Antioch Church in the Countryside YMCA. David's been pastoring that for 15 years. He's in a little bit of a midlife crisis moment.
Oh, thanks.
David has purchased 2 pairs of glasses in the last month. Is that right? He's got his smart-looking glasses and his hip blue light glasses.
Yes.
So, David, before we go any further, can you just explain to us why you're wearing the smart glasses today?
Well, I'm wearing the smart glasses so that I can try to sound somewhat intelligent on this great concept. There are times where I need to wear the hip ones so I can feel not old and irrelevant.
Yeah, you preached in the smart glasses for the first time.
Yeah, because I was preaching in Revelation, right? So I need a little extra oomph to it. So,
okay, so
do I look smarter? The hearers can't hear me, but do I look smarter now as I put my glasses on?
I'm a little intimidated.
You've got a great radio face.
Okay, thank you. By the way, Mike is my brother. If you have not caught on to that.
Okay, so we've talked about what the city movement is and kind of why we're here, why we're recording this podcast. We're going to spend the rest of our time today just talking about us, David Newman, Mike Newman, myself, and kind of how we got here. So, David, I figured you would be the best place to start that.
Yeah.
So why don't you just give our listeners an intro to David Newman and how the YMCA and planning churches in YMCA has become such a passion in your life?
Yeah. Okay, so thanks, Jeff. So I grew up, Mike and I both grew up in Green Bay, Wisconsin. We could actually step outside of our front door and look up and see Lambeau Field in the distance. And our dad was the chaplain of the Packers. And even from an early age, we had this passion for sports that was kind of mixed up with this passion for ministry. We loved the platform of sports as a means to share the gospel. And I remember at a young age just playing basketball at the YMCA and hanging out at the YMCA. And we even had, Mike, if you remember this, we had a Christian school that we went to that met in the YMCA. And it seemed like the YMCA was this merging together of sports and ministry and just maybe the place where good things were happening. And, that was kind of shelved for years then. I went off to college, got married to my amazing wife. we traveled the world doing ministry, and then wound up in a place called Gloucester, Massachusetts, where I pastored our first church. And I remember while I was there, I was just young, didn't know anything about being a pastor. Sometimes I still don't feel like I know anything about being a pastor. I remember I was 22, 23 years old. I would go to my church office in the morning and do all my morning pastor stuff. And then at noon, I would go as fast as I could to my local YMCA. And there I would play basketball with people who were very far from God. I remember starting a Bible study there and spending time with people at the Y. And Ashley, we had one baby at that time, and she did a little mother's play group / reading group with other women at the Y. And we began just absolutely loving being at the Y and doing ministry there, until I remember in my story, something kind of was planted within me and began to bloom within me, saying, I love doing ministry where people already gather, where people already hang out. Could I do even church ministry in a Y? And I remember it was about this time that I began studying some of the history of the Y and the stories of the Y, and even the global purpose statement of the Y. And I started discovering some things that we're going to talk about in future podcasts that truthfully just was absolutely amazing to me, because I had no idea the story of the Y, or the great leaders that have shaped the course of history in the YMCA, and even what the Y is meant to be all about. And I just remember reading these stories, reading the purpose statements, and saying, wait a second, that sounds like what a good church should be all about. Like, if the Y is really about that, that sounds what I'm longing for in a church. Maybe I could help plant a church connected to the Y. And in a cool story in God's amazing grace, he led us to help kind of replant a church in this Y in Lebanon, Ohio. From there, our story has just kind of, it's just taken all kinds of new directions as we've discovered both other churches already connected to YMCAs, as we've helped plant churches in our local YMCAs, and as we have kind of traveled all over the world building YMCA churches together in third world countries, and seeing that there is an amazing amount of churches connected to YMCAs. Yeah. To the point, I'll close my story like this. I've leaned my whole life into saying, I believe the YMCA is one of the great sleeping giants of the world. And if it would wake up to its true mission and purpose, I love the thought of putting a church in every YMCA, because I think that would help it do that.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I liked what you said about how as you were learning more about the YMCA and the stories of the Y and the purpose of the Y, that kind of woke up something in your heart.
Yep.
My name is Jeff Snyder. I'm the executive pastor at Antioch Church in the Countryside YMCA, and that is how I came into this, is learning those stories from David. I started coming to Antioch in 2011, came on staff in 2014, and in that time period, I began to learn that, okay, this church is more than just about the Y as a convenient place to meet until we can build a building. I began to learn kind of the culture of, no, this is our home. This is where we are dwelling. And as I began to learn more about the organization of the Y, its purpose, its mission, and what biblical church planning looks like, I began to kind of be on board and understand this vision of, okay, so what does it look like to plant more churches and YMCAs outside of our little sphere? Yeah. And so I've been on staff for 6 years and am excited about broadcasting this message, getting more churches on board, bringing more clarity to the movement.
That's good.
And so Mike, why don't you share, maybe give us a little background into who you are besides David's pipsqueak brother?
I love it.
And what role you play here?
Yeah, man. So Hannah and I got married 17 years ago, and we moved to East Africa for 2 years. And we knew together as a couple that we wanted to serve Christ and just to make his name known. But I think it was there where we really fell in love with the church and saw the importance of the local church. Where we were, I had the opportunity to disciple a few pastors and plant a church in the village in Moshi, which is right next to Kilimanjaro. It was really fun.
That's awesome.
But like
Kilimanjaro safaris in Disney World?
No.
Great question, but not.
Okay, I've been watching The Animal Kingdom on Disney Plus.
Yeah,
and
that's
it just makes
awesome.
me want to go to
Yeah.
Disney World.
And so when we were there, it was like discipling guys, and it was just evident that if they were to grow in maturity and serve Christ, that it had to happen in the local church. And each church is called on a unique mission, and they're all to fulfill that function of to be a light to the nations.
Yep.
When we went to seminary in the States after our time in Africa, and began to see churches all over Dallas, Fort Worth fulfill their function of being a light to the nations. Some churches had buildings, which is great. Some churches met in schools, and some churches, met in movie theaters and things like that. In 2017, we were called from Antioch Church to come here, to be on staff for a year, and then to be planted in another church, to plant a church in another Y, just south of here. And I think that both Hannah and I were just gripped by the mission and the vision that we weren't supposed to be just ambiguous with where we were to shine our light in the community. Or I wonder how, of course we're going to love our neighbors, we're going to love, the other parents that are on the, their kids are on the same team and this and that, but like, to be specific as a community, to say we're going to love our community by loving and serving this local YMCA. What does that mean? Well, I mean, obviously we're going to talk about it a whole lot, but like, we describe it as this is a platform of ministry for our church, like a sending grounds to where it's our very DNA of our missions page, right, on our website.
Yeah.
Like, this is what we do. We jump in here, and so it's been fun and fruitful to have the Y as a platform of ministry for our church.
Yeah.
So
and we should say
sense?
this totally.
Yeah.
And we should say this right at the start of this podcast. We love the church, and we love how God, in his creative grace, just does all kinds of local churches all over the world. I love that right now there's little house churches gathered together in closed countries. I've been a part of churches in the jungles of Africa that meet around a tree. I've seen Cowboy Church in Texas where they pull up, truck beds and they sit in a circle and they do church. God uses his church, and certainly there's churches in buildings all over America, all over the world. Mm-hmm. Praise God. This is a unique niche. But we also believe that it's very special. And we're overjoyed to share it and to share what we've learned through joys and sorrows and failures. And just to give it just maybe one vision picture that we really attach to biblically, we think this is the well of the community. In John 4, you guys know the story if you're probably listening to this podcast, but Jesus comes to Jacob's well, and the well there was the gathering point. People went there to meet the physical need. They went there to, get water. But more than that, they went there to hang out. They went there in the cool of the day. Business was done there. And it was a cross-section of community, young and old, every race, every gender. They hung out at the well. And we think Jesus loved the fact that he sat by the well, talked to a woman about her physical need, and used it as a moment to offer her greatest spiritual need, to offer her living water. And we think the YMCA can be the well of the community. It's a place where people come from many different reasons, many different moments, many different things draw them there.
Yep.
But we can offer living water at the well.
Yeah, that's a nice little insight into what we're going to be talking about in our next episode, Why the Why, where we'll be talking about the why being the well of the community and why we believe that church planning and the YMCA is such a good marriage. So, anything else you guys would say?
So would you say this is a YMCA podcast or a church podcast, or what would you guys say?
Yes.
Aha.
Yeah. I would say yes.
Yeah.
It's for both.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if you guys don't have anything else, I'll wrap us up. Thanks for tuning in to our first episode of the City Movement Podcast. If you've listened this long, thank you. Please join us for our next episode, where I think we'll really start to get into some of the meat and potatoes of why have church in a YMCA. We'll go a little bit more deeply on that. So please come back for episode 2. For David Newman and Mike Newman, I'm Jeff Snyder. That was the City Movement Podcast.